The Slack notification popped up on my screen at 8:12 on a Monday morning. Please join us in Raven Conference Room. Immediate attendance required. 3 people were already inside when I walked in. HR, the new CTO, and a 27-year-old consultant wearing white sneakers with a navy suit that still had fold lines from the packaging. The first thing I noticed was my access badge sitting on the table. Not disabled. Removed. The CTO folded his hands like he was about to announce quarterly earnings. Margaret, after evaluating operational efficiencies, we've decided to transition infrastructure management to our new AI-driven autonomous monitoring platform. I looked at him for a second, then at my badge, then at the consultant who couldn't stop tapping his Apple Watch. You're replacing me with software? I asked. The consultant actually smiled. Not software, he said. Adaptive intelligence. I still remember the hum of the air vent over the conference table, because for about 5 full seconds, nobody else breathed. My name is Margaret Holloway. I was 48 years old when they removed me from the company directory at 8:26 a.m. on October 3rd. I'd worked at North Stream Logistics Systems for 22 years. Officially, I was Senior Infrastructure Systems Architect. Unofficially, I was the reason their distribution network functioned without collapsing every holiday season. North Stream handled freight coordination for medical suppliers, industrial manufacturers, and regional retailers across 11 states. Not glamorous. But when our system stopped moving, hospitals ran short on supplies and factories stopped production lines. People noticed that kind of thing very quickly. I started there in 2001 when the company had 1 server room and a backup generator that failed every time it rained. By the time they pushed me out, I designed and overseen 3 regional data centers, migrated 84% of the company's infrastructure off physical hardware, and built the failover environment that reduced downtime incidents by 91%. In 2017 alone, the redundancy protocols I implemented prevented an estimated $4.3 million in shipping losses during a winter storm that knocked out half the Midwest. Nobody outside IT ever heard about that, of course. Success in infrastructure is invisible. People only notice when things break. I built the Sentinel routing layer myself in 2018. It was basically a traffic control system for data loads between regional centers. If one server cluster started overheating or lagging, Sentinel redistributed traffic before clients noticed delays. Simple concept. Extremely difficult execution. Then there was HarborWatch, the monitoring framework I built after a ransomware scare in 2020. It caught irregular traffic patterns and isolated suspicious activity before infections spread internally. We never had a successful breach after that. The board congratulated the CTO for modernizing security operations 2 years later. He'd arrived 6 months earlier. That was Daniel Mercer. Age 39. Expensive haircut. Teeth so white they almost looked blue under fluorescent lighting. He was the CEO's former golf partner. Officially, he'd been recruited from a venture-backed startup in Austin that specialized in AI-enhanced operational ecosystems, which sounded impressive until you realized it meant they made dashboards for companies too small to hire actual engineers. The first time Daniel toured the primary server floor in Indianapolis, he stood in front of a rack cluster worth about $2.8 million and asked me, completely seriously, "So where's the actual cloud part?" Not joking. He said it while holding an espresso. I remember because Luis Ortega nearly inhaled a cough trying not to laugh. Luis had been our lead network engineer for 9 years. Quiet guy. Former Navy. Usually impossible to read emotionally. But after Daniel walked away, Luis muttered, "We're all gonna die here." Daniel loved meetings. Not useful meetings. Performance meetings. Vision meetings. Synergy meetings. He used phrases like decentralized cognition architecture and predictive infrastructure elasticity without understanding what any of those words actually meant. During one executive review, he pointed at a latency graph on the screen and announced, "We need to optimize the bandwidth algorithm velocity." Silence. Then Cheryl from finance blinked twice and asked, "Velocity of bandwidth?" Daniel nodded confidently. Exactly. That was the moment I realized something important. Nobody above him understood technology either, which made him dangerous. Within 3 months, he started bringing in consultants barely old enough to rent cars. One of them was Bryce Talbot, 28, artificial intelligence specialist. Hairstyled like he spent more on it than groceries. Bryce wore designer sneakers into server rooms and referred to infrastructure engineers as legacy operators. He mispronounced Kubernetes 3 separate ways in one meeting. Kubernetes. Then Kubers. At one point, Luis finally corrected him. Bryce laughed and said, "Terminology's not really important anymore. AI abstracts all that." I wrote that sentence down afterward. Not because it mattered then. Because people like Bryce always leave evidence accidentally. The real shift started in January. Daniel announced Project Atlas during an all-hands meeting in Chicago. He stood under a massive presentation slide that said, "Autonomous infrastructure is the future." Then he spent 40 minutes explaining how AI-driven monitoring would eliminate human inefficiencies from systems management. I sat in the third row beside Cheryl. Daniel clicked through slides full of colorful diagrams that clearly came from consultants charging by the hour. Finally, he looked directly at me. "Legacy infrastructure thinking," he said, "creates operational bottlenecks." The room got quiet. Then he smiled. "But we're evolving." After the meeting, Cheryl caught up with me near the elevators. "That felt targeted," she said carefully. "It was. You okay?" I pressed the elevator button. "Depends," I said. "How attached are you to functioning payroll systems?" She laughed. Then realized I wasn't entirely joking. For the next 6 months, Daniel slowly stripped authority away from senior engineers. Approval chains changed. Access permissions shifted. Meetings started happening without operations staff present. Bryce began presenting infrastructure summaries to executives using reports my team generated. Sometimes word for word. Once, during a quarterly review, he literally presented one of my disaster recovery flowcharts with the title page removed. I watched him explain my own framework incorrectly for 12 minutes. Nobody noticed except Luis. Afterward, he walked into my office holding a coffee cup and closed the door. "You want me to say something?" he asked. "No. He's stealing your work." "I know." Luis stared at me. "You're weirdly calm about this." I opened a monitoring dashboard on my second screen. Panic wastes energy. The real betrayal happened on a Thursday. Cold rain outside. 34 degrees. Indianapolis traffic backed up for miles because someone overturned a semi near I-70. I remember all of it because my body records details when something important is happening. At 4:47 p.m., my Outlook notification chimed. Subject line: Organizational restructuring, your position. There it was. Corporate America always uses the same language when they're about to remove someone. Restructuring. Optimization. Strategic transition. Like adding syllables makes it humane. The meeting was scheduled for 5:15 in Raven Conference Room on the 14th floor. Same room from the Monday meeting. This time there were 6 people inside. Daniel, HR Director. Bryce, 2 legal representatives. And our COO, Martin Greer, who couldn't look directly at me for more than 2 seconds. There was a folder sitting in front of my chair. Already prepared. That part always fascinates me. The paperwork is finished before the conversation even starts. Daniel folded his hands again. Same posture. Same rehearsed empathy. "Margaret, after careful evaluation, we've decided to eliminate your position as part of our AI modernization initiative." Outside the conference room windows, rain streaked against the glass in thin, crooked lines. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Daniel continued. "We're transitioning core monitoring and systems management responsibilities to Atlas AI." Bryce nodded beside him like a proud Labrador retriever. Daniel slid the folder toward me. 12 weeks severance. Continuation of benefits through January. Standard non-disparagement agreement. I opened the folder slowly. Not because I needed to read it. Because silence makes nervous people talk more. And Daniel was already nervous. "You understand this isn't personal," he added quickly. "The industry's evolving." I looked at him. Then at Bryce. Then at Martin, who still couldn't meet my eyes. What exactly, I asked calmly, do you believe I do here? Bryce answered before Daniel could. With modern AI observability, most manual oversight functions become redundant. Manual oversight functions. That sentence cost them $31 million. At the time, though, I just nodded once. I see. Daniel relaxed slightly. He thought the difficult part was over. Then he said the thing that finished him. We'll need you to document your workflows over the next 2 weeks to ensure a smooth knowledge transition. There it was. The arrogance. The assumption that 22 years of operational instinct could be converted into onboarding documents and PowerPoint slides. I closed the folder. Of course, I said. Martin finally looked up. And for the first time all meeting, he looked uncomfortable. Because he knew. Not everything, but enough. The room felt aggressively cold. Corporate buildings always overcompensate with air conditioning after business hours. Somewhere down the hallway, a printer kept chirping every 30 seconds. Nobody moved while I stood. Daniel extended a hand. I looked at it for a second too long, then shook it once. Good luck, I said. That was all. No speech. No argument. No scene. Bryce actually looked disappointed. Like he'd prepared himself for drama and got denied the performance. I walked out carrying the severance folder under my arm. Half the office pretended not to notice me crossing the operations floor. A few people suddenly became fascinated with their monitors. Cheryl looked sick. Luis stood when I passed his desk. You serious? He asked quietly. Apparently. He shook his head once. This place is screwed. I almost smiled. Probably. Then I kept walking. What they didn't know was that I'd already spent 18 months preparing for this exact possibility. Not because I expected to be fired. Because competent infrastructure people always prepare for executive stupidity eventually. Back in February, when Daniel first started talking about eliminating human dependency layers, I began documenting every operational process I owned. Every escalation path. Every vendor contact. Every recovery sequence. Everything. Neatly organized. Indexed. Timestamped. I even color-coded sections by regional impact severity because I'm apparently incapable of doing anything halfway. By my final week, the documentation archive was over 11,000 pages across encrypted internal repositories. Luis joked it looked like I was preparing evidence for war crimes trials. In a way, I suppose I was. But documentation wasn't the important part. The important part was what never got documented. See, Nord Stream's infrastructure officially ran through automated balancing systems managed by Sentinel and Atlas integration layers. Officially. In reality, there were 14 manual stability overrides I'd created quietly over the years after repeated executive refusals to approve proper infrastructure upgrades. Tiny interventions. Temporary fixes that became permanent because they worked. One rerouted traffic loads during peak pharmaceutical inventory cycles every Tuesday night. Another prevented overheating on aging server arrays in Kansas City by manually redistributing processing loads during humidity spikes. One of them corrected a memory leak issue in an outdated vendor application that the software company still hadn't patched after 4 years. Atlas AI monitored the systems. I kept them alive. There's a difference. And before anyone imagines sabotage, no. I didn't damage anything. Didn't delete anything. Didn't hide anything contractually required. I simply stopped performing unpaid invisible labor nobody knew existed. That distinction mattered enormously later. My last day was October 17th. I handed over credentials. Completed transition meetings. Answered questions. Bryce recorded 2 training sessions while nodding aggressively at terms he clearly didn't understand. At one point, he interrupted me. So Atlas handles the environmental balancing autonomously now, right? I looked at him carefully. It handles reported environmental variables. He smiled like he understood the difference. He did not. At 5:03 p.m., I walked out of North Stream carrying 1 cardboard box. Picture frames. 2 notebooks. A ceramic coffee mug Luis gave me in 2016 that said, I survived another system outage. The parking garage smelled like wet concrete and motor oil. I remember sitting in my car for a full minute before starting the engine. Not sad. Just tired. 22 years reduced to a cardboard box and an exit checklist. Then my phone buzzed. Luis, you home yet? No. Long pause. They already locked themselves out of Denver replication. I closed my eyes briefly. That was fast. You have no idea. I drove home in silence. 48 hours later, the first regional outage hit. Small at first. Phoenix data routing instability during a pharmaceutical shipment cycle. Normally a 20-minute correction. Atlas misread the load balancing spike as anomalous traffic and initiated containment restrictions instead of redistribution, which would have been manageable if Bryce hadn't overridden the escalation warnings because he thought the alerts were false positive recursion loops. I know that because Cheryl forwarded me the internal memo later. The result? 3 major clients lost inventory synchronization for nearly 6 hours. Estimated loss, $870,000. By Monday morning, Daniel called me for the first time. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded different already. Tighter. Margaret, quick question regarding the Phoenix balancing environment. MHM. We're seeing some unusual recursive load behaviors. Okay. Pause. Then faster. The Atlas predictive framework isn't properly stabilizing node distribution. Translation. The servers were starting to eat themselves alive. I took a sip of coffee. What would you like me to do about that? Another pause. We were hoping you could clarify some undocumented operational dependencies. Undocumented operational dependencies. That's one way to describe 22 years of institutional survival instincts. I documented all official procedures before departure. Yes, but apparently there are additional manual interactions occurring inside the routing environment. Apparently. I almost admired the understatement. Daniel lowered his voice. Can you walk Bryce through it remotely? No. Silence. Then, no. My severance agreement finalized Friday evening. Margaret, this is a critical business continuity situation. And I'm no longer an employee. The line went quiet long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. Finally, he exhaled sharply. We may need temporary consulting assistance. There it was already. Not even 72 hours. I'm unavailable this week, I said. Which was technically true. I was making lasagna. An hour later, Luis texted me from his personal phone. You didn't hear this from me, but Bryce just restarted the Phoenix node stack manually. I stared at the message. Then typed back. Why? 3 dots appeared instantly. Because he thought the balancing tables were corrupted. I put the phone down slowly. That was catastrophic. Restarting active node stacks during unstable synchronization conditions was like rebooting air traffic control mid-flight because one radar screen flickered. At 11:14 p.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Martin Greer, the CIO. I answered on the 4th ring. Margaret. He sounded exhausted. In the background, I could hear overlapping voices and what sounded like a conference speakerphone echoing. Bryce triggered a cascading replication fault. There it was. Finally said out loud. How extensive. We lost Phoenix's synchronization. Denver's unstable now too. I stood and walked toward my kitchen window. Rain again. Same cold weather system as the week before. How many rollback failures? I asked. Martin hesitated. 6. That got my attention. Because 6 meant the containment protocols were already failing across regions. Then he said the sentence that told me they were in real trouble. The Atlas platform can't identify the origin point anymore. Of course it couldn't. Atlas only monitored visible infrastructure relationships. The hidden manual corrections were never part of its learning model. It was trying to solve a puzzle while missing 14 pieces. Behind Martin, someone raised their voice sharply. Then another voice interrupted. Then I heard Daniel say, "No, just get her back on the line." Martin lowered his voice. "Margaret, things are deteriorating pretty quickly here." I looked out at the rain sliding down the glass. And for the first time since they fired me, I smiled. Very slightly. Because now reality had entered the room with them. And reality doesn't care about PowerPoint presentations. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. By the end of the 2nd week, North Stream wasn't dealing with an outage anymore. They were dealing with institutional panic. The Denver Center failed first. Not completely. That would have been cleaner. Instead, it drifted in and out of synchronization every 40 minutes like a dying heartbeat. Freight routing requests duplicated themselves across regional queues. Inventory systems started generating conflicting shipment confirmations. Drivers arrived at warehouses for loads that technically existed in one system and vanished in another, which created a very specific kind of corporate nightmare. Nobody knew which numbers were real anymore. Finance froze outgoing reconciliation approvals by Tuesday morning. Legal got involved by noon. And compliance entered the situation Wednesday after a pharmaceutical distributor in St. Louis reported chain of custody inconsistencies on temperature-sensitive medical shipments. That one got ugly fast. Nord Stream's biggest healthcare client, Argent Medical Supply, held a $74 million annual logistics contract with strict federal compliance requirements. One shipment discrepancy triggered an automatic audit review. 3 days later, Argent suspended new routing authorizations indefinitely. Daniel tried to reassure the board with a presentation Friday afternoon. Luis sent me screenshots afterward. I still have them somewhere. Daniel stood in front of a projection screen labeled Atlas Recovery Status, Stable Trajectory. Meanwhile, behind him, half the metrics were visibly red. One slide literally showed regional instability escalation events, increasing by 312%. And somehow he still said the phrase, "We're seeing encouraging stabilization patterns." Apparently, encouraging now meant actively collapsing. The real disaster happened during the client call. Argent's operations director joined remotely with 2 compliance attorneys present. Martin Greer later told me the entire room felt like a hostage negotiation. Daniel attempted to explain the outage using terminology Bryce had clearly coached him through. The machine learning optimization layer encountered an unexpected recursive environmental anomaly. Long silence. Then Argent's director asked one question. Did your company lose operational control of shipment verification? Daniel hesitated. Never hesitate in front of lawyers. That single pause cost Nord Stream nearly everything. By Monday morning, Argent officially suspended the contract pending external review. Estimated immediate revenue exposure, $19.4 million. And that was before penalties. Then came the board. You can tell when a crisis reaches board level because executives stop using polished language. Everything becomes short sentences and exhausted faces. Martin called me Thursday evening around 9:30. I was sitting on my back porch wrapped in a blanket drinking tea. Margaret, he said immediately, I need you to understand how serious this has become. Behind him I could hear overlapping voices again. Always overlapping voices now. How bad? He exhaled slowly. Chicago replication failed this afternoon. That got my attention. Chicago handled interregional coordination between all 3 primary centers. If Chicago destabilized, the entire infrastructure started fragmenting into isolated environments. Translation? Systems stopped trusting each other. Root cause? I asked. We don't know. You do know. Silence. Then quieter. We think Atlas started looping corrective actions against its own containment responses. Exactly what I expected. The manual overrides I'd maintained for years acted like pressure release valves. Without them, Atlas kept escalating stabilization responses against conditions it misunderstood. It was essentially arguing with itself at machine speed. Martin sounded older than I'd ever heard him. The board's demanding external forensic review now. MHM. Daniel says he can recover the environment internally. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not cruelly. Just reflex. Martin heard it. That bad? Martin, if Chicago fragmented this early, your dependency mapping is already corrupted. Long pause. Then quietly. Jesus. That same night, Bryce made the mistake that finished his credibility permanently. Someone, probably legal, decided executives needed a live demonstration showing Atlas recovery progress. Bryce volunteered. Of course he did. Nothing destroys overconfident people faster than public visibility. The demonstration happened in front of board members, department heads, and 2 external auditors. Luis gave me the replay details afterward almost word for word. Bryce attempted to manually reinitialize synchronization queues during active replication recovery, which he absolutely should not have done. One command. That was all it took. He accidentally triggered a full rollback cascade across Denver and Chicago simultaneously. Warehouse tracking screens froze mid-update. Shipment manifests disappeared, then reappeared duplicated, then disappeared again. One operations manager reportedly stood up and said, "Are we getting hacked right now?" Bryce panicked and started clicking through terminal windows trying to undo the rollback. Except he didn't understand the dependency hierarchy. So every correction triggered another fault. Luis said Daniel physically shoved Bryce away from the keyboard at one point. In front of everyone. The board meeting ended 15 minutes later. By the following Monday, Nord Stream's estimated losses crossed $31 million. Not theoretical losses. Actual financial impact. Client penalties. Emergency recovery vendors. Idle freight contracts. Compliance exposure. Overtime. Revenue suspension. The company's stock dropped 11% in 4 trading days. And suddenly the woman they called legacy overhead became very important again. The first rail offer arrived Tuesday morning. Martin asked to meet in person. We met at a quiet steakhouse downtown around 7 p.m. Corporate people always choose restaurants with dim lighting when they're about to apologize financially. Martin looked terrible. Tie crooked. Eyes bloodshot. Phone vibrating every 3 minutes. He didn't even order food. "Margaret," he said carefully, "the board authorized me to make you an offer." I waited. "We'd like you to return as Senior Recovery Director." Not even my old title anymore. Interesting. He slid a printed compensation sheet across the table. Base salary, $410,000. Performance bonus. Emergency retention package. Equity options. It was nearly triple my previous compensation. 3 weeks earlier they'd called me obsolete. Now they were pricing survival. "I'm flattered," I said. Martin almost smiled from relief. Then I slid the paper back. "No." His expression dropped immediately. "Margaret. No authority, no accountability structure, and Daniel still controls executive infrastructure approvals. We can work through that." "No, you can't." He rubbed both hands over his face. "We are bleeding clients." "I know. Then what exactly is it going to take?" I looked at him calmly. "For the people responsible to admit what happened." That landed harder than the money discussion. Because financial mistakes can be absorbed. Ego cannot. Martin stared at the table for several seconds. Finally, he said quietly, "You want Daniel removed?" "No." That surprised him. "I want documented accountability." There's a difference. Wednesday afternoon, Cheryl called me from her personal number. She sounded exhausted. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said immediately, "but they just froze executive discretionary spending." That's aggressive. It gets worse. Apparently, the board had commissioned external auditors to review the Atlas implementation timeline, which meant emails, meeting records, approval chains, budget reallocations. Every terrible decision now had timestamps attached. Cheryl lowered her voice. "Daniel spent almost $4 million migrating systems away from your manual stabilization protocols because Atlas flagged them as non-scalable human dependencies." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course it did. Bryce probably trained the system to classify undocumented corrections as inefficiencies instead of safeguards. "Margaret. MHM. The board's furious." I took another sip of tea. Good. Then Friday happened. That was the breaking point. A storm system outside Kansas City triggered power fluctuations near one of the aging cooling arrays I used to manually stabilize during humidity spikes. Without the override adjustments, server temperatures climbed too fast. Atlas interpreted the thermal anomalies as localized hardware failures and began rerouting traffic aggressively across already unstable regions, which overloaded Chicago again, then Denver, then Phoenix. Within 43 minutes, all 3 regional centers were partially offline. Not dead. Worse. Fragmented. Some clients could access systems. Others couldn't. Data synchronization froze between regions. Drivers sat in warehouse lots waiting for manifests that wouldn't load. hospitals called asking where emergency inventory shipments were. And somewhere inside Nord Stream headquarters, executives finally understood the difference between automation and understanding. At 11:18 p.m., Daniel Mercer called me directly. Not Martin. Not HR. Daniel. I answered because I was curious what desperation sounded like on him. There was no polished executive voice left. No buzzwords. No confidence. Just panic wrapped in exhaustion. Margaret, he said immediately, we need you back in the building tonight. No. Please listen. I am listening. We cannot stabilize the replication environment. I know. We've brought in 3 external recovery firms and nobody can untangle the dependency conflicts. That also made sense. Because the infrastructure wasn't broken in one place. It was broken relationally. The systems no longer trusted their own state information. Daniel's breathing sounded uneven. We're losing operational continuity. There it was. The corporate translation for disaster. What exactly are you asking for? I said. Long silence. Then finally, I need you to come back and take control. Not assist. Not consult. Take control. I leaned back in my chair. And Bryce? Another silence. He's gone. Interesting. And Atlas. Pause again. We shut autonomous control layers down 2 hours ago. There it was. Reality, finally signing the paperwork. Daniel spoke again, quieter this time. I was wrong. I let that sit there for a moment. Not because I needed revenge. Because some sentences deserve silence afterward. Then I said, I'll send my conditions in the morning. The board meeting happened Saturday at 10 a.m. 4 executives. 2 attorneys. Martin. Daniel. And me. Same Raven conference room. Same humming air vent. Same long polished table. Except this time my badge was waiting at my seat already activated. Funny how quickly access gets restored when revenue disappears. Daniel looked like he hadn't slept in days. Bryce was nowhere in sight. Good decision. I sat down and placed a printed contract folder on the table. Martin opened it first. Then slowly looked up. You prepared this already? I'm an infrastructure architect, I said. Preparation is the job. Condition 1. Independent Executive Infrastructure Authority reporting directly to the board for 24 months. No executive overrides without written approval. Condition 2. Emergency recovery consulting rate of $600 per hour during active stabilization. Plus a 2-year executive contract at $520,000 annually afterward. Condition 3. Full reinstatement of my engineering staff with minimum 20% salary increases, including Luis Ortega as Director of Network Reliability. Condition 4. Formal written apologies placed in personnel records for terminated infrastructure staff affected by the Atlas restructuring. That one made legal visibly uncomfortable. Good. Condition 5. Comprehensive board-level incident report documenting the decision chain leading to the outage. Names included. That's where Daniel finally spoke. No. Calmly. Firmly. The board report stays internal and anonymous. I looked at him. Then closed the contract folder. Then the meeting's over. Martin immediately leaned forward. Wait. Daniel stared at me. You're asking for a public execution. No, I said evenly. I'm asking for institutional memory. Nobody spoke. Outside the glass walls, I could see employees moving through the hallway trying very hard not to look inside. Finally, one of the attorneys cleared his throat. If accountability documentation remains board confidential, but formally attributed internally. No, I interrupted softly. Margaret. If people are punished privately while failures stay politically ambiguous, this happens again in 3 years. Daniel looked furious for about half a second. Then exhausted. Which was worse? Martin turned toward him slowly. And that was the moment I realized the power structure had already changed. Not dramatically. Quietly. The dangerous kind of change. Daniel, Martin said carefully, we don't really have leverage here. No one contradicted him. 10 minutes later, every condition was accepted. Including the report. I walked back into Nord Stream headquarters that afternoon at 2:14 p.m. The operations floor went almost silent when I stepped off the elevator. Not theatrical silence. Relief silence. Luis stood so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. You came back. Apparently. He laughed for the first time in weeks. Cheryl actually looked emotional. Again, nobody cried. This wasn't that kind of place. But tension leaves visible marks on people. And those marks were everywhere. I walked straight into the command center. 6 monitors offline. 3 engineers arguing quietly near the Phoenix dashboards. Emergency vendor representatives clustered near conference speakers pretending they understood the infrastructure. I set my bag down, then pointed at one screen. Disable cross-regional auto reconciliation. An engineer blinked. Entirely? Yes. But that'll slow. Yes. Luis was already moving. I pointed at another display. Who restarted Denver replication after containment failure? One contractor raised his hand slowly. Why? He swallowed. Atlas recommended it. Atlas also helped destroy the company, I said. Let's stop asking it for advice. Nobody argued after that. For 72 straight hours, we rebuilt synchronization integrity manually. One region at a time. No automation shortcuts. No consultant theater. Just engineering. Real engineering. By Tuesday morning, Phoenix stabilized. Denver followed Wednesday night. Chicago finally synchronized Friday afternoon at 4:11 p.m. When the final regional integrity check completed successfully, the entire operations floor went quiet for about 3 seconds. Then people started breathing again. Actual breathing. Like the building itself had been holding tension for weeks. Luis leaned back in his chair. Tell me we're done. I checked the monitoring board one last time. Green across all regional clusters. For the first time in nearly 2 months. We're done, I said. Nobody cheered. That would have felt strange. Instead, people smiled quietly at their screens and went back to work. Infrastructure people are like that. 6 months later, Nord Stream looked completely different. So did I. My official title became Chief Infrastructure Resilience Officer, which honestly sounded slightly made up. But it came with board authority, veto power over operational risk decisions, and a compensation package substantial enough that my financial advisor actually stopped mid-sentence the first time he reviewed it. Luis thrived as Director of Network Reliability. Turns out giving competent people authority works surprisingly well. Cheryl moved into Executive Financial Operations Oversight after helping expose the Atlas implementation failures during the board review. Even Martin improved. Stress will either clarify people or destroy them. In his case, it clarified. We rebuilt the infrastructure from the ground up over 8 months. Not flashy rebuilds either. Boring resilient systems. The kind executives never brag about because they work too well to notice. We formalized every manual stabilization dependency into transparent operational architecture. No invisible labor. No undocumented heroics. If a system required human intervention to survive, leadership knew about it in writing. Every quarter. Mandatory. We also implemented something called Operational Continuity Review. Simple policy. No executive could eliminate a critical technical role without independent infrastructure audit approval. That policy alone probably saved 3 departments from future innovation initiatives. As for Daniel, he stayed. That surprised a lot of people. But honestly, it was the right call. Removing him completely would have let everyone pretend one person caused the entire disaster. That wasn't true. A lot of people nodded along because buzzwords sounded modern and questioning them felt uncomfortable. Daniel lost authority over infrastructure permanently. Board approval became required for any operational technology initiative he touched. His presentations got shorter after that. Much shorter. The last time I saw him attempt jargon during a meeting, he stopped halfway through the sentence, looked at me and said, "Margaret, can you explain this properly? Growth comes in strange forms." The final audited cost of the outage landed at $31.8 million. Not counting reputation damage. Not counting lost sleep. Not counting the 11 days where half the company looked like survivors from a maritime disaster. But Nord Stream survived. Stronger, honestly. Cleaner systems. Better governance. Less ego driving technical decisions. Funny what catastrophe can accomplish. Personally, My life got quieter. Better. I stopped sleeping with my phone beside the bed. Started taking weekends seriously. Bought a small lake cabin 3 hours north where there's barely enough signal for email. Sometimes that feels like the greatest luxury of all. A few months ago, Luis mailed me a new coffee mug for my office. White ceramic. Black lettering. This system requires human oversight. I laughed for a solid minute when I opened it. The old mug still sits beside it on my shelf. Sometimes people ask if I regret going back. I don't. Because despite everything, North Stream was still full of good people trying to keep important things moving. Drivers. Dispatch coordinators. Engineers. Warehouse teams. People who actually worked. They deserved systems built by adults instead of PowerPoint presentations. And honestly, watching competent people regain control of their own company was far more satisfying than watching it fail. I still think about that first meeting sometimes. Raven conference room. The hum of the air vent. My badge sitting on the table waiting to be taken away. Back then they thought infrastructure was software. Something interchangeable. Something automatic. But systems aren't held together by dashboards. They're held together by people paying attention when nobody else notices something's wrong. That's the part executives forget. Invisible work still matters even when it's invisible. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, the most dangerous person in any company is usually the one quietly keeping everything from falling apart.